Good day and welcome to today's newspaper review. Here are a roundup of what the newspaper is saying this morning on the headlines. We'll start with the Punch newspaper. There are a lot of stories dominating the Punch newspaper this morning, and we'll take just few of the newspaper. On the lead page, Oyo Borno adoption, tough terrain, casualties fear tall rescue mission. Still in the Oyo and Borno adoption of the school pupils and teachers, and there are tough terrains of casualties as fears is dominating the whole place due to the rescue mission. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then at the top of that newspaper, federal government debt repayments exceed budget allocation by nearly 2 trillion naira. You get the full story on page 27 of the newspaper. The federal government are owing a lot of debt and it has exceeded the budget allocation. Still in the same newspaper, on power outage, NERC orders compensation for Band A customers. You get the full story on page 28 of the newspaper. Then on 2027 election coming from the INEC avoids primaries held after May 30th. You get the full story on page 41 of the newspaper. INEC voids primaries held after May 30th. So the deadline for every party primary is on the 30th of May 2026, and INEC is voiding every primary that has commenced or will commence before or after May 30th. Still in the same newspaper, Dangote refinery wraps up to 700,000 barrels per liter, strengthening Africa's energy landscape. You get the full story on page 38 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Guardian newspaper. At the cover page of the Guardian newspaper, there are so many headlines there, which some are actually surfacing again from the previous newspaper. And the lead page of that newspaper is World Environment Day, how abuses, poor regulations fuel health crisis, economic losses. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. It is World Health Environmental Day today, and abuses, poor regulations has fueled a lot of health crisis and economic loss in the past few years. Still in the same newspaper, on the page 3 of that newspaper, NCDC urges governments to boost Ebola prevention funding. NCDC urges governors to boost Ebola prevention funding. You get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. Ebola is back again, and the NCDC are urging governors to boost Ebola prevention in order to prevent Ebola from spreading around the state. Then in the same newspaper as well, state police framework almost ready for constitutional amendment. The state police framework almost ready for constitutional amendment. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then in page 3 of the newspaper, coming from the Federal Capital Territory Minister Nyesom Wike, he has mocked Turaki-led faction groups for nominating Jonathan. Still in the same newspaper, on page 3 of the newspaper by the right, Nigeria finishes 5th as South Africa leads top performing African countries. Nigeria finishes 5th as South Africa leads top performing African countries. Kudos to South Africa on their performance so far. So you get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. And then on page 4 of the newspaper as well, federal government screens 400 Nigerians for repatriation from South Africa due to the South African xenophobic attack between South Africans and Nigerians. The federal government has screened over 400 Nigerians to return back to Nigeria. Still in the same newspaper, at the foot of the newspaper on page 6, anxiety grows over insecurity as federal government ramps up rescue operations. Anxiety grows over insecurity as federal government ramps up rescue operation. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust. On the Daily Trust, in page 3 and page 4 of the newspaper, parties sit on candidates list. Parties sits on candidate list. This is very sad if this allegation is actually true. Then at the top of the newspaper, constitutional framework for state police to be out soon, coming from the presidency. The presidency says that constitutional framework for state police will be out soon. You get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper. Then on page 11 of the newspaper as well, despite rowdy section, House yet to finalize on minority leadership, still on politics. Then at the left of the newspaper, security guard killed as bandits abduct 4 in Abuja. Security guard killed as bandits abduct 4 in Abuja. They get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Heartfelt condolence to the deceased and family, and this is very sad, where bandits, ISIS, Boko Harams are beginning to overpower our security guards. That means if our security guards can be overpowered by these bandits, then that means we need to secure ourselves. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom of the newspaper, UN demands release of abducted pupils, teachers in Oyo and Borno. You get the full story on page 5 of the newspaper. The United Nations has demanded for the release of those pupils and teachers that were adopted in Oyo and Borno state. Then on page 10 of the newspaper, 7 die as farmers header clash in Bauchi. Very sad. We'll move away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. Boldly written on that newspaper, security tightens around Aso Rock. Security tightened around Aso Rock. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper as Sowore leads Abuja protest, demands release of kidnapped school children. Federal government not learning from past attacks coming from Atiku. So the reason why this security is being tightened around Abuja is because Sowore has led protest in the streets of Abuja over the kidnapped of those school children, pleading that the school children should be released. And then Atiku in his response says that the federal government have not learned from their past attacks. I don't know if he's referring to the Chibok girls attack or the previous attacks that have been happening prior to this time. Then at the top of the newspaper, this is actually surfacing again on page 25. Dangote refinery ramps up to 700,000 barrels per liter, strengthening Africa's economy landscape. Then on page 4 of the newspaper, fear grips schools over worsening insecurity. You know, schools is supposed to be a safe place where our children go to learn. But at this juncture, there's even parents are even scared to send their children to school because the environment is not even safe for them, and mostly almost all the schools will eventually close down. Schools in the rural areas will eventually close down due to insecurity. Still in the same newspaper on page 6, this is coming from Peter Obi. Ezekwesili charges Nigerians to stop attacking Adeboye over insecurity and economy. So the former minister Obiageli Ezekwesili and Peter Obi has charged all Nigerians to stop attacking the cleric, that's the RCCG pastor, over insecurity, and rather focus their attention on solving the problem that Nigerians are facing instead of pointing accusing fingers. Then on page 8 of the newspaper, leadership minority reps in rowdy section as members clash over forgery allegation. Reps in rowdy section as members clash over forgery allegations. You get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 25, international students groan as CBN restricts tuition payment to $25,000 per semester. We hope that these students will be able to survive due to this increment from the Central Bank of Nigeria. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent. On the front page of the newspaper, we have a lot of stories, a lot of headlines, and also follow-up headlines as well. But we'll take few of the newspaper as well. Then on page 29 of the newspaper, on the lead page, flight operations at risk as Nigeria's jet A1 crisis deepens. Experts push for direct crude allocation to local refiners. You get the full story on page 29 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper at the top of the newspaper, establishment of state police nears reality, presidency reviews. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. So the federal government are establishing state police, and the presidency has actually revealed that the process is coming closer than expected. On page 27 of the newspaper as well, stakeholders pin Nigeria's surging food costs on structural flood. At the bottom of the newspaper as well, Tinubu deploys special rescue teams for abducted Oyo school children and teachers. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper as well. Still in page 7 of the newspaper, Osun police investigate shooting of Accord Party local government chairman. This is very sad. Then still in the same newspaper, Nigeria's anti-terror strategies failing to evolve. Article warns that Nigeria's anti-terror strategies is failing to evolve. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Then on page 29 of the newspaper, this is coming from the WEF. Global financial fragmentation threatens Nigerian and others. Moving away from that newspaper to the Vanguard. And the Vanguard newspaper, the front page, there are so many stories, so many headlines on the Vanguard newspaper, but take few of the headlines. Then on the front page of the Vanguard newspaper on page 5, federal government vows to crush kidnappers, rescue pupils in Oyo and Borno. We wish the federal government hasten on these reforms. And still in the same newspaper at the top of the newspaper, Peter Obi to youths. Don't expect Adeboye to champion change at 84. You get the full story on page 9 of the newspaper. Exactly. You don't expect Pastor Adeboye to champion change at the age of 84. You know, this is for the federal government to actually move into action. And on page 19 of the newspaper, CBN unveils new FX guidelines, approves cash movement of $50,000. Then in page 2 of the newspaper, still on politics 2027, only Jonathan can speak on his political future. Ex-president's camp insists. You know, this war between the Turaki-led faction and the Wike faction, the Turaki faction has actually picked Goodluck Jonathan as their presidential candidate. And yes, Goodluck Jonathan has not come out to say anything. So the ex-president's camp are saying that only Goodluck Jonathan has the right to speak on his political future. At the bottom of the newspaper, UN demands immediate release of adopted Nigerian schools pupils and teachers. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. We move away from that newspaper to the Matrix. On the Matrix newspaper, there are so many headlines dominating the front page of this Matrix newspaper. Then on page 2 of that newspaper, this is actually on insecurity, anger, protest rock Nigeria. So the streets of Nigeria is filled with protests over the kidnap and the adoption of the school pupils and teachers in Oyo and Borno states. And on page 3 of the newspaper at the top, actually, Money Point Group CEO advocates credit layering on Nigeria's payment infrastructure as CBN rolls out PSV 2028. You get the full story on page 28 of the newspaper. Hope rises for state police as federal government nears constitutional breakthrough. You get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. This story is actually surfacing again. Then on page 23 of the newspaper, Emeka Ike condemns alleged data exposure, begins legal fight. Still in the same newspaper by the right of the newspaper, NDC defends primary elections, moves to reconcile aggrieved aspirants. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. The NDC held their National Executive Committee meeting, and Peter Obi was addressing the aggrieved aspirant who did not make it to the ticket, and he has reconciled with them that everyone should come together and work. I mean, in life, possibility of failing and winning is not really guaranteed. Sometimes you fail and sometimes you win, but it doesn't really mean that there should be division within a party structure. Still in the same newspaper, police clamp down on fake Tinubu voice syndicate. Arrest social media user over Abuja security alarm. You get the full story on page 9 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On page 2 of the New Telegraph, where we have a lot of headlines dominating the front page of the newspaper. Federal government moves to rescue 4,000 Nigerians as xenophobic attacks spread in South Africa. Federal government moves to rescue 4,000 Nigerians as xenophobic attacks spread in South Africa. Traumatized Africans escape into bush and mountains. This is very sad. I mean, a neighboring country fighting their fellow neighboring countries. They're supposed to watch out for each other, but we don't know what is happening between the South Africans and the Nigerians who are in the diaspora. Still in the same newspaper on politics, this is coming from Hiowada. 2027 APC awaiting legal department's report before submitting candidate list. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on page 5 of the newspaper, FCC seeks tribunal stronger funding to enforce federal character principle. Then on page 4 of the newspaper as well, Nigeria will work in my lifetime, declares Tunde Bakare. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom of the newspaper, federal government vows to crush terrorists, rescue abducted pupils in Oyo and Borno state. You get the full story on page 2, 4, and 27 of the newspaper. Then on page 5 of the newspaper, U.S. House vows to ruin in Trump's war powers in rebuke over Iran. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. This is actually the last newspaper for this segment. On the front page of the newspaper, we can see that a lot of headlines is dominating the newspaper, and this is actually resurfacing again some of this newspaper, some of these headlines. We've seen it in the previous newspaper, but we'll just take a few of them that we didn't take the previous newspaper. Constitutional framework near completion, coming from the presidency. So you get the full story of that in page 2 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 2, federal government assures safe return of abducted pupils, teachers in Oyo State. Then on page 2 of the newspaper as well, NNPP urges INEC to obey court orders on party leadership, threatens protest. NNPP has urged INEC to obey court orders on party leadership, and they have as well threatened protest. I mean, INEC is supposed to be neutral and not partisans. Instead of interfering in party politics, they should just remain neutral. Now the NNPP they've threatened to go on protest if INEC do not obey the court's rulings. Then on page 4 of the newspaper, alleged cyberbullying, court declines Sowore's adjournment prayer. Then on page 5 of the newspaper, coming from the NITDA, Nigeria's greatest asset is human capital, not natural resources. At the bottom of the newspaper, minority leader race, reps in rowdy sectioned over alleged signature forgery. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching, and do well to join us next time for more breaking news. Do have a beautiful day.